I'm Ira Fistell, and this is a discussion of American history. Now, people say, why study history in the first place? I've heard students tell me history is irrelevant. I don't have to study history. And I've heard many people tell me history is boring. Why should I study history? Why should I care about history? Well, history isn't boring, and history is relevant, and there are a lot of good reasons to study history, most important of which is, if you don't know where you came from, how do you know where you're going? The question that I like to ask in American history is, this is what we are today. How did we get that way? Why are we what we are? Why is the United States the great country that it is, the great power that it is? Why does it have the stresses and strains that it has? Why has it developed the way it has? And there are very good reasons why. The idea of history is not to give a bunch of dates, to memorize a bunch of dates and say, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's not history. Nor is history a large body of facts to be memorized. History is an art. It's the art of writing or interpreting the past from the evidence available. And historians are our licensed myth makers. Historians look at what is available in the past, what evidence is available about what happened, and try to interpret what happened and why it happened and how it happened, and try to explain it. No one historian ever agrees entirely with any other historian on almost anything. Let me give you an example. Supposing 5 people are watching, standing on the corner, just watching all the girls go by, and along comes a car with, say, 2 people in it, and from the other direction comes a truck. And the car and the truck collide, spin around, people are injured, there's a lot of damage on the street. Police are called. The police ask the 5 people, all right, what did you see? Do you think those 5 are going to give exactly the same story of what they saw? And they were right there on the scene at that time. I'll bet you'll get 5 different stories of what happened. Now take the position of the historian. The historian doesn't have people to ask who were there. The historian has to go back through whatever available documents he may have, whatever eyewitness reports he may be able to find by people who wrote it down, and then decide what happened. And sometimes it's impossible to really know whatever happened. And then the question becomes, is it really important what actually happened? What's really important is the way the historian interprets it. Now, with all that in mind, let's ask the question of why American history? Why did we get this way? What does American history tell us? Well, first we start with America. Before there was American history, there was a continent of America. North America, South America. We're talking particularly about North America here. And the continent of North America was a relatively wide open and unknown and untracked space. The total population of Native American Indians was probably not over 1 million or more in the entire North American continent before the Europeans came. It's a continent of enormous natural resources, absolutely unheard of natural resources by standards of the Europeans who eventually came here. Simply the forest land alone in America was overwhelming for anyone who came from Europe. They'd never seen trees like this. Miles and miles, square miles, acres of gorgeous, tall trees of all sorts. The timber resources of North America alone must have been equal to 5 or 6 times or 10 times even the timber resources available in Europe. And nobody even knew how much timber there was there. Even to this day, we don't really know how much there is. Just to give you an example that you may not have realized, take a state like, say, North Carolina. Do you realize that 75% of North Carolina is covered with forests? 70% of Mississippi is covered with forests? States you wouldn't think of as forested at all. And this is true all over the United States with the exception of the Great Plains. Let's take a look at the continent as it existed before the Europeans came. As you start down the Atlantic coast from mouth of the St. Lawrence, you'll find that there are mountains very close to the shore. For example, in Maine, the mountains come right down to the seacoast, almost like Norway. And as you go further south, that mountain chain, the Appalachian chain, which is a very old mountain range, as mountain ranges go, gets further and further away from the seacoast until it disappears in northern Alabama. Where is all that flat land that exists in what is known as the Piedmont area of the Carolinas, for example? That flat land between the seacoast and the mountains doesn't exist in the north because the mountains are close to the water. Where's the flat land? Well, you guessed it. It's underwater. The flat territory that is, we know as the Piedmont, the great growing region in the southeast, is actually underwater. It's a continental shelf off the coast of New England. Where you have that kind of a continental shelf, what do you think you have? Fish. Lots and lots of fish. Abundant fisheries. Fisheries in North America, especially off that part of North America, were renowned and still are. One particular kind of fish dominates, the codfish. And if you happen to go to the Massachusetts Capitol building, State House in Boston, you will see hanging over the speaker's rostrum a codfish. It's the sacred cod of Massachusetts. And it has been a major element in the economy of the colonial times right up until the present. Codfish is associated with Massachusetts. You ever heard of the story about the man who went to Boston to get scrod? Well, that's what scrod is. It's codfish, and codfish is associated with that Grand Banks fishing area off Newfoundland, and again that whole area, that whole fishery of that continental plain of North America. As you go further south, you get that wider coastal plain between the Appalachians and the coast, and that coastal plain is very good growing land. Added to that, the fact that as you go further south, the North American continent enters almost to the tropic zone. It doesn't quite, but it's very close to the tropic zone, and you have a very long growing season, a growing season of perhaps 200 days a year in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. It's very warm, good crops, very good cropland, and there's also abundant rainfall in that part of the country. As you go west, across the Appalachians, and of course in Indian times it was very difficult to cross the Appalachians, but if you got your canoe portaged across down the Ohio River, you come into the great central basin of the North American continent. It's one of the richest areas in the entire world. It's structured by three great rivers: the Mississippi, which starts at Lake Itasca in Minnesota and flows more or less straight south through the Gulf; the Ohio, which starts at Pittsburgh, where the rivers of the Appalachian chain come together to form the Ohio River, the Monongahela and the Allegheny; and the Ohio falls into the Mississippi at the town of Cairo, Illinois. And the third great river is the Missouri, which begins in the Rocky Mountains of Montana, comes down through the Dakotas and across the state for which it's named, Missouri, flows into the Mississippi just above St. Louis. The watershed drained by the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Missouri is immense. Millions of square miles of tremendously rich cropland, some of the richest cropland in the world. You think of Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, huge areas of rich cropland, the corn belt of the universe, you might say. As you go further west, then, you run into the Great Plains. The difference between the Great Plains and the area east of the Missouri River, the Great Plains start roughly 50 miles west of the Missouri River herself, is that the Great Plains area has no rainfall, or very little rainfall. The ground would be very good if it were irrigated, and it is good wheat-growing country because of irrigation, because of crop technology. But there is comparatively little rainfall. For the 500 miles or so east of the Rocky Mountain chain, the Rocky Mountains hold the clouds with the rain and dump all the rain in the Rockies in the form of rain and snow. And for all those 500 miles or so east of the Rockies, the rainfall is very sparse. This is the great growing area of wheat of Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota, the wheat belt states. Then comes the Rocky Mountain chain itself, extending all the way up from Canada, the spine of the continent, Continental Divide, right down through Colorado and New Mexico to Arizona and on into Mexico. The Continental Divide is that line, that fictional line, on which any drop of water which flows on the east side eventually winds up in the Atlantic Ocean and its tributary, the Gulf of Mexico, whereas any drop of water that falls on the west side eventually winds up in the Pacific Ocean. There's a third natural divide in North America, but it's in Montana and Canada, and that's the divide between the watersheds of the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic. A drop of rain falling on the north side of that divide eventually makes its way to the Arctic Ocean. So there are three great divides in North America. The great river of the east is the Mississippi, as you know, the Mississippi, Ohio, Missouri system. The great rivers in the west, the Colorado and the Columbia. And in Canada, there's the Great Red River of the north, which flows into Great Bear Lake and then up into the Arctic Ocean. West of the Rocky Mountain chain is the Great American Desert. The states of Arizona, Nevada, Utah, sagebrush and cactus, mile after mile. No water, no habitation, no trees. And then you get to the Sierra Mountains. The reason why the desert, because the Sierras do the same thing the Rockies do. They hold the cloud cover coming from the west and dump all the rain and snow in the Sierras. The Sierras are very jagged, high mountains. In fact, Sierra means jagged in Spanish. And Nevada, the other name, means snow-covered. It tells you exactly what those mountains are like, jagged and snow-covered. West of the Sierras is the coastal plain. The state of California, most of it, and Washington, Oregon, parts of that. Good growing area. And in fact, in San Joaquin Valley of California, again, one of the world's greatest crop areas. So this is the huge North American continent, rich in every conceivable resource: oil, coal, iron ore, bauxite, tin, you name it, it exists in North America, plus all that great growing land. And this whole immense continent was populated by perhaps 2 million Native Americans, maybe even less than that. No one knows where the Indians came from either. The theory, of course, for a long time has been that they crossed the land bridge from Asia over the Bering Straits and through Alaska and then down into North America, Central America, and South America. But there are some good reasons for believing that perhaps that isn't true, and that perhaps the American Indians were generated in South America or Central America and moved north, at least some of them. That's a mystery yet unresolved. At any rate, the native population was very small, and the country was simply teeming with game, with animal life, fur, enormous resources, untold resources. The Europeans. Nobody knew there was a North American continent out there. When Columbus began thinking about sailing west, he was thinking about reaching the known Indies, India, China, the rich lands that Marco Polo had discovered in 1212 when he went from Italy east to China. Europeans had begun to think differently after the 500 years of the Dark Ages. The Crusades began to make them think, first of all, about going elsewhere outside of Europe, and also the need to find spices became a very important thing. Why? Because there was no refrigeration. And if you had a piece of meat and you wanted to eat it, you'd probably have to spice it to dull the taste or to preserve it in any way you could. Meat rots very quickly if it's not spiced. And so spices were very important to the Europeans as part of the diet. Also, as Europe began to reach out to the Crusades into the Holy Land, and the Italians, begun by Polo, began to explore the trade routes east, other nations began to look for routes to the east to find those spices and that wealth in the Indies. Let's not forget the wealth. The Europeans were very interested in the enormous resources of the east too: gold, silver, and cloth, all the things that the east had to offer. The Italians, and particularly the Venetians, controlled the overland routes. So as other nations, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, began to seek routes to the east, they began to think of different ways to get there. The Portuguese tried to sail around Africa, and indeed they did. Diaz, Vasco da Gama, found India by sailing around the south tip of Africa. Columbus, who was an Italian in the employ of the Spanish court, had the idea of sailing west to reach India. He thought of sailing around the world, which he thought was a good deal smaller than it really is. And so when he began to set out on his voyage, he didn't think he was going to bump into the continent of North America. He didn't even know it was there. And when indeed he did bump into the islands of the Caribbean, he thought they were India, which is why we have the term American Indians. They have really nothing to do with India at all. Nor was Columbus the first European to sail that way. We know that Leif Erikson and the Vikings came to Greenland and probably to Newfoundland as early as the 10th century or 11th century. There is a possibility that Irish navigators might have found their way across the Atlantic. It's even thought that the Phoenicians, the ancient Phoenicians, may have done so 1,000 years before. So Columbus was certainly not the first European to come to North America. We know that he wasn't. But the legends die hard, and the legend that Columbus discovered America is not going to die. At any rate, around the 15th century, late 15th century, Europeans began to sail, explore. And one of the things that made it possible for them to do that was the development of mathematical instruments which allowed them to navigate, and larger and stronger ships which allowed them to sail longer distances. Once the Spaniards and the Portuguese began to sail, other nations, the Dutch and the English particularly, and the French, wanted to get in on the act. And in Europe at this time, there was a great deal of struggle going on. In the 16th century, in the 1500s, Holland, which had been controlled by Spain, went to the Protestant Reformation and declared itself an independent country, not wanting to be controlled by Catholic Spain. Same thing happened in England, where Henry VIII declared England free of the authority of the Pope. And these countries then had a religious difference with the Catholic South, and particularly Spain. The Spaniards weren't content to leave it that way, and for 20 years or more, Spain tried to subdue Holland, ending in the victory of the Dutch Republic and the proclamation of the Dutch Republic independent from Spain late in the 16th century. In 1588, of course, the great story, the Spaniards tried to conquer England, sent the huge armada against England. Elizabeth, Queen of England, and her great admiral, Sir Francis Drake, with the aid of a timely storm, subdued the armada and drove it back. And so England and Holland both experienced great national triumphs in the late part of the 16th century. Now, if you study history, you find a peculiar thing happens. Over and over again, you can spot it time after time. When a nation accomplishes a huge national victory in some way, usually a military victory of some sort, it frequently is followed by a terrific outpouring of creative energy from that nation. In Holland, you see it in the terrific Dutch art that came on in the early 17th century, the 1600s, following the triumph of the Dutch Republic. You also find it in commerce. The Dutch established the East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, huge trading companies that made Holland for a time the most prosperous part of Northern Europe. Same thing happened in England. The Elizabethan age was a flowering of arts, particularly in the realm of language. The two greatest treasures of the English language, the 1607 authorized version of the Bible, the King James Version, and Shakespeare's plays, both date from this period, immediately following the defeat of the Armada and England's assumption of national status. So the countries of Northern Europe, and particularly those two, began to reach out from their own small areas, England and Holland being very small countries, across the Atlantic looking for colonies. Why were colonies desirable? Well, Spain had already proved in her conquest of Mexico that colonies could be very, very rich. The Spaniards wanted gold, and they found gold in Mexico and in Peru. And they subdued the Aztecs and the Incas, and they stole everything they could. And those riches made Spain the great power of the 16th century. The English and the French and the Dutch would like to have had that too. And they all hired navigators and sent expeditions out to find colonies. But there was another reason also. The political philosophy, or the economic philosophy of the times, was called mercantilism. And the idea was that a nation state would be stronger and wealthier if it had colonies as a source of natural raw materials and to ship to the home country, where the home country would then make goods and ship to the colonies. And the idea was to pile up wealth in the home countries. Now, this theory was the predominant thinking in economics up until 1776. Every country wanted colonies, not so much for markets, but as a source of raw materials and natural wealth. Spain had already had them, and now France, England, and Holland sent expeditions to North America to establish their own. Sir Walter Raleigh, the great courtier under Queen Elizabeth, was one of the first. He sent expeditions to North America, failed twice to establish a colony, and finally, the third time around, did establish the colony of Roanoke Island in 1587. 3 years later, the ships came back from England to support the colonists with more colonists and goods, and they found the colony disappeared. Nothing at all remained, except one word carved in a tree trunk, word Croatan. And if you are a detective and you want to solve one of the great mysteries of North American history, tell me what Croatan means. That's the colony, by the way, in which Virginia Dare became the first English child born in America. And she disappeared, of course, at the age of 3, along with the rest of the colony. The British were finally successful in planting a permanent colony in 1607 at Jamestown, Virginia. Jamestown is named for the new King of England, James I, who succeeded Queen Elizabeth in, if I recall correctly, 1607, was it? The colony, 1604, I think James became king, something like that. And this also brings up a fact that you can tell in American history. If you look at the names of places, you can pretty well frequently tell, who founded them, where they came from, and when they came. For example, if you look at the east coast of America, you will find Maryland, state of Maryland. Maryland was named for Henrietta Maria, who was the Queen of England under Charles, King Charles. And so you can tell that Maryland had to be founded before 1660, and 1649 rather, when Charles I got the gate. You can tell Jamestown, I mentioned King James. You can tell in Carolina is simply a version of Charles, again. Charlotte, North Carolina, is named for the Queen Charlotte. So you can tell New York State. You will find, if you look at the map of New York, you'll find Dutch names such as Kinderhook or Schuyler, all those Dutch names. You'll find Rome. You'll find, obviously, settled by Genoa, settled by Italian immigrants, and so on and so on and so on. The earliest English colony, as I say, the permanent colony, was Jamestown. Jamestown was founded by colonial adventurers who were out to make money. But there were other groups in England who also were interested in leaving England for one reason or another and coming to America. And some of those were motivated by religious reasons. The Reformation of 1649 was carried out largely by radical Protestants led by Oliver Cromwell. Before 1649, there was great tension, and those Protestants were being persecuted, as they felt, by the Church of England. They also, in many cases, felt that the Church of England was either needed reforming or was beyond reforming and needed replacing. And so in 1620, a group of those separatists who didn't want to belong to the Church of England anymore, known as the Scruby Group, got together under the leadership of a minister named Robert Brown. The Scruby Group came from East Anglia, part of England, east of London, northeast of London, and they wished to be free to practice their radical religion as they chose, separating completely from the Anglican Church, which established Church of England. In order to do this, they were forced to leave the country. They first went to Holland, where religious toleration had been in effect since the Dutch won their independence from Spain. Obviously, the Dutch were interested in religious toleration because they needed it, having been oppressed by the Spanish Catholics. But the Scruby Group people found in Holland that everything was fine except one thing. Their children were learning to be Dutch, and they wanted to remain English. And so, in 1620, they managed to get together with some Plymouth merchants to get a leaky old ship called the Mayflower and sail across the Atlantic Ocean to Virginia, which had been founded, as I mentioned before, in 1607 by the Jamestown adventurers. Well, on the way, the Mayflower was none too steady, and the colonists ran out of beer. They also lost their way, and they made landfall in December of 1620 in what is now Massachusetts, at Plymouth Bay, and decided to stay there rather than try to go on. After all, they were out of beer. So they did stay and founded what we now call the Pilgrim Fathers. They were the Pilgrims. 10 years later, a much larger group of Englishmen who wanted to reform the Church of England but not leave it altogether also came to Massachusetts. They landed in what is now Boston and called themselves the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they brought with them their colonial charter, so that Massachusetts Bay was pretty much independent from England right from the beginning because they had the charter in hand. The Plymouth colony didn't have a charter like that. They made up their own. They called it the Mayflower Compact. They agreed while they were on the boat to agree to create a government and to follow the leadership of the governor who was elected immediately after they got there. The Mayflower Compact was based on the kind of compacts that Protestants used to form churches, except that it went not only to religious matters but also to civil matters. So by 1630, there were 3 major English colonies, permanent English colonies in North America. About the same time, the Dutch sent out a colonial expedition. They had begun sending out expeditions, in fact, early in the 17th century, and in 1609, Henry Hudson, who was an Englishman, but who was under the authority of the Dutch Republic and was paid by the Dutch, found what we now call the Hudson River. He was looking not for a colony in North America, but for a way through North America to get to the Indies. The old idea of a passage through North America onto the Indies was still continuing to be important. They still wanted to reach the wealth of the Indies. And Hudson sailed up the Hudson River for 150 miles and found that this enormous passage to the interior kind of did not go anywhere. It trickled out and didn't go across the continent. But his discovery led to the founding of a Dutch colony at the mouth of the Hudson in 1624. It was called New Amsterdam, and of course, you know the famous story of how the governor, Peter Minuit, traded some trinkets and blankets and beads to the Indians from Manhattan Island. Some people think he shouldn't have done it, but at any rate, 24 hours worth of trinkets bought Manhattan Island, and the Dutch settled there in 1624. It remained a Dutch colony for some years, then was in a war between England and Holland in 1660, was captured by the British and became, instead of New Amsterdam, New York. Another of the early colonies was Maryland, and Maryland also was founded for religious reasons, but for a different religious reason. Among the results of the deposing of King Charles and the Reformation in England was the persecution of Catholics. Catholics were not popular in England at this particular time, and the colony of Maryland was founded by George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, who was a Catholic nobleman, primarily as a refuge for Catholics. And so Maryland early practiced religious toleration, but from the Church of England for Catholics. Another of the early colonies was South Carolina. South Carolina was founded by some friends of the king, notably the Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper, and his associates. They were in it for the money. They had ideas of making huge profits in America, and they settled the colony of South Carolina in I think it was 1680, I'm not sure, 1690, 1680 to 1690. Later moved it to the city which is now called Charleston, again after the King, Charles. And Charleston, South Carolina has been a major port city ever since. It's favored by that location where the Ashley and the Cooper Rivers, as they say in Charleston, come together to form the Atlantic. But what they really found in Charleston was a terrifically congenial climate for growing rice and indigo, crops which could not be grown in England. Very hot climate. In Virginia, meanwhile, they found another crop that they could grow that would bring them cash on the barrelhead, literally, and that was tobacco. Tobacco cultivation began in Jamestown about 1615 or so, and King James I, by the way, was not pleased with the idea of smoking. And at one point, smoking was considered illegal, immoral, and fattening. But when the king began to see how much revenue tobacco was bringing in the form of taxes, the age-old debate over tobacco, is it bad for your health or is it good for your pocketbook, carried the day with James, and tobacco cultivation in Virginia became a major industry. We get the term cash in the barrelhead simply because tobacco was shipped in large barrels. And when you bought tobacco at the dealers, he would ask you to put your cash on the barrelhead before he'd sell you the tobacco. And so we get that term, cash on the barrelhead. Those are some of the early settlements in 17th century colonial America. There also, we should not forget, were other settlements by other nations. Spain had founded the colony of St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest permanent settlement in North America, in the 16th century. In 1610, Spanish explorers from Mexico founded the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the capital of New Mexico to this day. And in 1781, somewhat later, but still in the colonial period, a group of adventurers sent by the governor of Mexico found a little town on the Los Angeles River, midway between a couple of the chains of missions in Southern California, called the city of Los Angeles. So Spanish settlements and French settlements in Canada were established at the same time the English ones were. We seem to concentrate on the English ones more because they are the direct descendants of our English-speaking North America. And we'll talk about why that's true as we go on. Another major English colony was founded in 1682 by William Penn. Of course, it's Pennsylvania. And there's a great story about the founding of that colony also. William Penn's father had been an admiral in the British Navy. And for his service, he was owed money by the King of England, King James II, I believe, at that time. Now, the catch was the kings of England have not had the power to tax since at least 1649, and actually before. One of the main purposes of the Revolution of 1649 in England was to protect Parliament's authority to be the sole taxing power and to prevent the king from assuming that power. So monarchs in England have always been, at least for the last 400 years or so, dependent on Parliament for money. Kings don't have cash in general. Only Parliament can tax, only Parliament has money. What the kings do have, or did have at that time, was land in America. And so the king paid off William Penn for his father's debt in a land grant in Pennsylvania, North America. The king, of course, had no interest in going to North America, figured the land wasn't worth anything to him, but William Penn had a particular project. He was a member of the Society of Friends, we call the Quakers, who were founded in England by George Fox, and who were a very persecuted sect in England. And Penn envisioned Pennsylvania as a refuge for religious dissidents, such as the Quakers and others. And also he envisioned Pennsylvania as an island of fairness and brotherly love. And so when he came to America, he purchased the land from the Indians, saw to it they were compensated for land which other Englishmen simply would have assumed was theirs by right from the king. Penn actually went and compensated the Indians. He also purchased the Swedish settlement at Chester, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, for cash. The Swedes had established their colony there, and Penn did not take it, he bought it. Penn was a scrupulous man in dealing. He believed in fairness, and he believed that all parties deserved fairness, even if they weren't English. He laid out a city himself. The city is known as Philadelphia, which means the city of brotherly love. And because the Quakers didn't believe in such vanities as naming things for people, in Philadelphia you will find no streets in the old part of the city named for kings or ministers, such as you do elsewhere. The streets are numbered in one direction, 1st Street, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and in the other they're all named for trees, chestnut, walnut, etc. with the exception of Broad Street and Market Street, because the Quakers, like many of the radical Protestants, did not believe in the vanity of naming things for people. And so William Penn and Philadelphia are a unique thing among colonies, 1682. Pennsylvania is known for religious tolerance, and there was another colony also known for religious tolerance. It's founded sometime earlier. Massachusetts, as I mentioned, was founded by Anglicans who wanted to reform but not leave the Church of England. But they were very strict, the Anglican Puritans who founded Massachusetts, and they did not believe in dissent. If you were a Catholic or a Lutheran, heaven forbid you should wind up in Massachusetts, because they would literally drive you out of town with a whip. One of the most ferocious of the Anglican ministers in the early days of the colony in Massachusetts was a man named Roger Williams. And Roger Williams is one of the great men in history, if only because he had the gall and the unmitigated gall and the tremendous courage to admit that he was wrong. In his persecution of dissidents, Williams came to see that this was a dead-end street, that if you were going to be that technical about religious purity, pretty soon there'd be nobody who was pure enough for you except maybe you and your wife, and you weren't too sure about her. And so he did a 180-degree about-face. And instead of demanding religious uniformity, he began to speak in terms of total religious tolerance for anyone, even non-Christians. Well, for those views, of course, he was booted out of Massachusetts. And he went to what is now Providence, Rhode Island, and created the colony of Providence, Providence meaning God's goodness, God's grace, in which he invited anyone to come and settle regardless of religious affiliation, absolute religious toleration. About the same time, a woman of enormous mental capacity and a very sharp tongue, whose name was Anne Hutchinson, who had the gall to criticize the governor of Massachusetts, also was driven out of Massachusetts, and also with her followers established a colony in what is now Rhode Island. The two were eventually combined into what is now called, officially, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. It's the smallest state with the longest name, and it was founded specifically for religious liberty. So those are the main English colonies in North America in the 17th century. Early in the 18th century, fear of those Spanish colonies in Florida, I mentioned St. Augustine earlier, and what they might do if they marched north into the rich lands of South Carolina, led an Englishman named General James Oglethorpe to go to the king with an idea. He proposed to create a semi-military colony which would act as a buffer between the Spaniards in Florida and the rich lands of South Carolina. And he proposed to do it with his own means. This sounded very, very good to King George I, who by this time was on the throne. And so Oglethorpe was granted a charter for the colony called Georgia, after George. Oglethorpe's idea did not only extend to semi-military protection for South Carolina, however. He had another end in mind. He was one of those great social reformers who believed that people were not necessarily bad just because they committed crimes. He believed that perhaps they'd been driven to crimes by forces beyond their control and that they were redeemable given the right social conditions. And so Oglethorpe established Georgia in part as a refuge for debtors from English prisons. In those days, you went to debt in England went to jail rather for owing a debt, and it didn't matter whether you couldn't pay it while you were in jail. That was too bad. If somebody didn't pay it for you, you rotted in jail. Well, James Oglethorpe took debtors from the English prisons and settled them in Georgia. And so he populated his colony at what is now the city of Savannah, laid it out himself as Penn had done in Philadelphia. These are the original English colonies in North America. They all had different origins. Many of them were founded for commercial purposes, some for religious purposes, others for military purposes, and at least in the case of New York and Pennsylvania, took over earlier colonies by other nationalities. So they did not start with the same motives or the same purposes, and they didn't start on the same wavelength either. They weren't all equal in starting. Of all the colonies, the one that was the biggest and the richest in the 18th century was Virginia, which had also been the first. Virginia likes to call itself the Old Dominion. It was the first dominion in North America. And because of the cash crop of cotton, and because Virginia had a charter which gave it enormous land claims to the Western Ocean, Virginia was the biggest and richest of all the colonies. In 1619, as tobacco cultivation was beginning in Virginia, a Dutch merchantman sailed into the port of Jamestown and offered a deal to the Virginia colonists. If the Virginians would pay in cash money, the Dutch were willing to sell them 20 Negro servants. Now, up until this time, one of the ways in which people came to the New World, the early colonies, was through an indenture. If you were poor, you obviously couldn't pay your passage across. So what you would do, if you were a poor man in England who desired to emigrate, was sign an indenture to a rich man who would have you work for him for 5 or 10 years or whatever it was, and pay your passage across in order to get you to come. Because it didn't do any good to own land in America if you didn't have people who could work the land, right? And not very many people wanted to come to America, the richer classes. Why should they? Much more comfortable in England. So indentures became a way of getting people to come to the New World. Now, at first, these indentures were entirely given to Englishmen. The Englishmen were the colonial founders, and Englishmen were who they wanted to work the land. But when the Dutch showed up with their shipment of Negroes, the colonists in Jamestown said, we need the help, we need the labor, and they agreed to make the purchase. Those original Negroes were not slaves in the sense that they were indentured the same way that the whites were. Slavery, African slavery, did not start full-blown. It started with the same kind of temporary indenture or contract of work as the whites signed. But over the period of the 17th century, up until 1700, and especially in the 18th century, after 1700 rather, conditions of Negro servitude changed. They became less and less indentured servants and more outright slaves. They were needed in Virginia and other southern colonies to work the land, because the land, as I mentioned, was cultivating cash crops, tobacco, and in South Carolina, rice and indigo. And those crops required a great deal of very difficult labor. And the climate was very, very hot. Englishmen had trouble doing that kind of work in the climate. They found that Africans could do it. And they also found that American Indians not only couldn't, but wouldn't. And so where were they to get labor? Well, the obvious supply was slave ships. Slaving was a big business in the 18th and 17th centuries. And as I mentioned, it was not the English who started it. It was the Dutch, although the English got into it, and so did the Americans. When you look at those colonies, and I mentioned they were all very different, what supported them? Well, in Massachusetts, I mentioned the fish before, and fishing and boating was always a big thing in Massachusetts. Why? Because the ocean was close to the seacoast, there were plenty of trees available for timber, for ships, and tall masts, and the fish were plentiful. Added to that, the fact that those mountains close to the coast meant that the soil was very rocky and very difficult to till, and the growing season was very short because it's cold up there. And so the people of the colony of Massachusetts quickly became ocean-minded, seafaring-minded, and fishing-minded. One step from fishing boats to sailing ships that go across the ocean. And by the middle of the 18th century, not middle of the 17th century, I should say, the seamen of Massachusetts became world-renowned in the way they would navigate the Atlantic, bringing goods back to England and also to other countries. And along about this time, the demand for labor in the South and the availability of shipping in the North and the labor supply in Africa began what is known as the triangle trade. A New England ship owner would take rum manufactured in Massachusetts and ship it to Africa. When he got there, the captain would sell the rum to the local tribes of the seacoast in Africa, who in exchange would raid the interior and bring back slaves from other tribes with which they were at war. Those slaves would then be shipped in those same ships across the Atlantic to Charleston or one of the other southern ports, or Savannah, one of the southern ports, and sold there, whereupon the captain would buy sugar, or sometimes sugar and sometimes tobacco, but often sugar, and bring that to Massachusetts to be made into rum again. And the profits from this kind of carrying trade, as well as fishing, supported the New England colonies largely. In the middle colonies, New York and Pennsylvania, there was much more farming. Obviously, the land was better, but also there was more of an interior to work with, too. The mountains weren't so close to the seashore, and you could go further into the countryside. When the Dutch came to North America, they had attempted to set up in New York, New Amsterdam, the same kind of land owning, land tenure that they had in Holland, in which rich patroons or bosses owned huge tracts of land and everybody else was a tenant. And they found that it didn't work in North America because the tenants got tired of working for the patroon and simply ran off and founded farms of their own on the land to the west. It's because of that that the patroon ships failed and land holding became a matter of small farmers owning their own land rather than huge patroon ships with lots of tenants. And this points up another fact about American history that is extremely important. Throughout the history of the United States and down to the present time, although a lot of you aren't going to believe it, The United States has been a country in which there is a tremendous amount of available land and a relatively short supply of labor. The ratio between land and labor is a very high ratio, especially by comparison with Europe or Asia, where there are far more people and far less land. And this means that the value of an individual working man is much greater, and his wages are therefore much higher in America than they would have been in Europe or in England. It also means that it is almost impossible, or has been almost impossible in America, to confine people to a permanent working class, because there was always the option of leaving your job and going west and finding yourself some land or something else to do. And so for that reason, largely for that reason, America has never begun to have, never even had, the kind of working class identity that people in European countries have frequently had, where the class structure was so much stronger. If you were working class, by golly, you were working class and that was it. You did not aspire to be, nor could you ever be, upper class. And that was never true in America because of that land-labor ratio. A crucial fact to remember in the history of America, why the American dream exists. Because the American dream essentially is that somebody who starts at the bottom can eventually reach the top. If he only works hard enough, is diligent enough and honest and keeps his mind on the goal and doesn't waste his substance, he can make it. In a word, that's the American dream. You can make it. Anyone can make it in America. And that dream is largely owing to the land-labor ratio. All right, we're talking about what supports the colonies. In the South, of course, the long growing season and the good soil and the great distance to the ocean, lots of land available for growing, cash crops, tobacco first, and then in the 18th century, another even more important cash crop, cotton. The problem with cotton always was there are two kinds of cotton, long stable, long fiber, and short fiber cotton. Long fiber cotton is difficult to grow anywhere. Short fiber cotton is much hardier and will grow a lot more readily, but it's hard to pick the seeds out of the cotton. But in the 18th century, Eli Whitney is credited with the first cotton gin. The others also developed cotton gins. A cotton gin simply is an engine for combing the seeds out of the short staple cotton. And once that was done, it became possible to plant huge acreages in short staple cotton anywhere in the South, almost anywhere in the South. And cotton brought big prices. In England, in the middle of the 18th century, the power of steam, as harnessed by people like Richard Arkwright, who built the first mills, turned the business of making cloth from a hand industry, hand-sewn industry, into a factory industry. And it meant that you could huge amounts of cloth to weave into clothes to be sold anywhere Britain could sell them. The textile industry was the first great manifestation of the Industrial Revolution. And it lived off of southern cotton. The cotton exports from Alabama, from Georgia, from North Carolina, less so North Carolina, Virginia, and later from places like Mississippi and Arkansas and Tennessee, all that cotton brought huge amounts of money into the South. And so the southern colonies tended to be rather more aristocratic than the northern colonies, in that the big growers who had more of the land could grow more cotton. And what you wanted, if you were a southerner, was to put money into land and slaves to grow more cotton and make more money. Whereas in the north, if you had money, you put it into ships. You didn't buy land because the land wasn't very good. You didn't buy slaves because the land wasn't very good. You couldn't grow anything with slaves. You put the money into commercial ventures. And so as early as the 17th century, as early as the 17th century, the dichotomy between the economies of North and South had already begun to develop. And it became more intensified throughout the 18th century and down into the 19th. When you look at that North American continent, which way did trade go? The English trade with the southern colonies went straight across the Atlantic. Cotton to England and manufactured goods from England back to America. And also to other countries, France, Holland, whatever. But under the mercantilist system, England forbade any other colonies to trade directly with the American colonies. Those were England's colonies. And if there was wealth to be made, England was going to make it. And so the trade with other countries had to be carried on through third parties, basically through the West Indies. The trade of the North, I mentioned the triangular trade, frequently was with other countries and other colonies in North America as well. For example, the Spanish colonies in Central America and the French colonies in Canada and in Central America also. Particularly the sugar islands and in the Caribbean, sugar being a big commodity. I also mentioned the French. as early as 1534, the French sought their role in North America, and the explorer Cartier came down the St. Lawrence River. Shortly after him, de Maisonneuve founded Montreal. Champlain came down the river also, another French explorer. They all came down the St. Lawrence and established a chain of French posts through the Great Lakes, one of them being Detroit, which means the strait, the narrow place, Fort Michilimackinac, which is now Mackinac Island, Michigan, where the three Great Lakes, Huron, Superior, and Michigan come together, and down into the Central Valley of the Midwest. Robert La Salle, the French explorer, came down the Mississippi in 1682. And coming up the other way from New Orleans, Frenchmen settled the cities of Mobile and New Orleans by early in the 18th century. And so if you looked at the map of North America at that point, early in the 18th century, you would see the British colonies on the seacoast, the mountain barrier, and beyond the mountain barrier, the French, controlling the Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes. The French were different in their colonial taxes than the English. Instead of settling huge numbers of Frenchmen, as the English settled large numbers of Englishmen, the French essentially cooperated with the Indians and had the Indians work for them in the fur trade. The French would set up trading posts, and they would sell trinkets and guns and whatever to the Indians in exchange for furs. Furs were very prized in Europe at this time because the style for beaver hats was very big. And the court of the French court at Versailles was particularly fashion conscious. And so the fur trade was a major motivation for the French in North America. Also, they realized something else. If you look at the map of North America and you see those great rivers, the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Missouri, flowing south to New Orleans, all that great territory, the central part of the country west of the Appalachians, is drained by those rivers. And in a day before steam power, the way you moved goods was on rivers. And where would all those goods naturally wind up? At New Orleans, the mouth of the Mississippi, from which they could be sent in ocean-going ships to Europe and South America. And so the French were very anxious to control the Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes, and to keep the English out. You can think of it as a cordon of French forts, beginning with Quebec and Louisburg out on the islands in St. Lawrence, Bay of the St. Lawrence, and going right down the St. Lawrence, past Detroit and Michilimackinac, and down to what is now Chicago, and down to St. Louis, Fort Crèvecoeur, Memphis, and Little Rock, founded by a Frenchman, de la Harpe, and on down to New Orleans. So the French, in other words, contended to contain the English in the eastern half of North America. Keep the rivalry between France and England, of course, was already going on in Europe. The most important factor of all in the founding of the North American settlements by the Europeans was, well, what do you think? What was the most important factor? The Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean was both a highway and a barrier. In a time before steam power, I just mentioned the way you moved goods was on rivers and also across oceans. You moved goods in boats. It was the only way you could efficiently move large amounts of heavyweight goods, because the only alternatives were animal power and human power, and walking on land with a horse, you can't pull nearly as much as you can in a boat. And so water power or water transportation was absolutely vital in the 18th century and the 17th century, and the Atlantic in that sense was a highway between Europe and America. But it was also a barrier, because the Atlantic is 3,000 miles wide, and in the day of sailing ships, it would take anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months to make a crossing of the Atlantic. And so at the same time, the Atlantic was serving as the pathway for Europeans to come to North America. It was also subtly serving as a barrier, keeping North America from becoming too European, making North America somewhat independent of Europe from the beginning. Different customs, different population, climate, and that huge ocean barrier between that meant that communications were necessarily delayed by weeks or even months. Never forget the importance of the Atlantic Ocean and the independence of North America. We are essentially an island surrounded by our oceans, separated from the rest of the world by the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other. Our history largely is Atlantic-oriented because the Europeans were closer than the Asians, and the Asians showed no great desire to span the 6,000 miles of the Pacific and come to North America. But the Europeans had every desire to span the 3,000 miles of the Atlantic and come to North America, even if they were originally looking for Asia. North America became clearly a resource by the middle of the 18th century. And so the colonial period developed. The total population in the English-speaking colonies was somewhere around 2 to 3 million by the middle of the 18th century. The largest city in North America was Philadelphia, which was in fact the second largest city in all the British Empire. Only London was bigger. Philadelphia had maybe 25,000 people at that time. The flourishing ports, Charleston, one of the great ports of the world at that time, New York with its natural harbor, Boston with its huge port, Rhode Island, Newport, the great port of Newport, Rhode Island, the fishing ports of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, later known for whaling. Those great port cities all looked towards Europe and towards trading areas of the Caribbean. And it was a flourishing economy indeed, but not entirely the same economy, the northern economy being very different from the southern. When we talk about the impact of the European settlements in North America, one thing we must talk about is what happened to the Indians who were already here. At the initial settlements, the Indians were not terribly upset, and the colonists pretty much relied on the Indians to leave them alone and just trade with them, and generally did not have any animosity. But the more English colonists who came, and the more they settled, and the more they wanted land, there was nothing they were hungrier for than land, the more the impact on the Indians began to be negative. The Indian societies were separated from each other. There was not one tribe of American Indians. There were so many tribes, many of them could not even speak to each other because their language was so different, and many of them were ancient antagonists of the others. So there was no way of putting up a united front against the English. Also, the English had the terrific advantage in technology. The Indians only had such weapons as they could get from the colonists in terms of modern weapons, firepower weapons. Otherwise, they were completely out-weaponed. And there weren't that many of them. Also, there was another factor. Shortly before the English colonists came to Massachusetts, for example, there had been a major plague in which many of the Indians of Massachusetts had died. And so the Indian population was weakened, and their ability to resist the incursion of the English was much, much less than it would have been 50 years earlier. So a combination of the diseases and the impact of the much more technologically oriented society and much more massive numbers of people meant that the Indians really didn't have a chance. Wherever they were, wherever they came in contact with the Europeans, the Indians were defeated and pushed out. Also, the attitude of the European settlers towards the Indians was somewhat ambivalent. Certainly, there was a certain admiration for the noble savage. But at the same time, the Indians were regarded as savages, somewhat not quite human, not quite settled, not deserving of the land. The land was the magnet, and if the Indians stood in the way, by golly, the Indians were to be pushed out. The more the Indians attempted to defend the land, defend their way of life, which was totally inconsistent with the English settlements, the more the whites were determined to get rid of the Indians. And when the Indians would, in fact, attack a settlement or a frontier cabin or something, the results were certain to be, over the long run, more antagonism against the Indians and more violence against them. The French attempted to cooperate with the Indians, largely because the French did not attempt to settle huge numbers of Frenchmen in their territories. And so the War of 1756-63 became known to the English colonists as the French and Indian War, because the Indians almost entirely were on the side of the French. But with the French and Indian War and with the fighting that followed the next 50 years, the power of the American Indian tribes was essentially broken. And while we regret in America, we certainly regret, if we're serious historians, the treatment of American Indians, they have been the great question mark, what to do with the American Indian. Because their way of life, which was largely food gathering, and in the case of the Plains tribes, nomadic, in the case of the New England tribes or the Central tribes, not so different. They were all different from each other, but in no way were their ways of life consistent with the idea of a commercial society owning property and using it to produce goods and services. The Indian lived more in sympathy with nature, in harmony with nature. The Englishman strove to conquer nature and turn resources to his own uses. And the inconsistencies of Indian society with the European society and the overwhelming weight of numbers and technology on the side of the Europeans meant that the American Indian never had a chance, essentially never had a chance after the earliest arrivals of the colonials. And then what to do with them? Once you've conquered them, then what? And that's been a great dilemma through American history right down to the present time. And this brings us to the 18th century and beginnings of the stirring of colonial independence.